let's see if I can get this going right. Welcome to Weekend Extra Edition. And I don't remember if this is 6 or 7.
Choose 7.
It's 6 or 7. And it kind of doesn't matter because it's another episode, so welcome to episode 6 and or 7. Last week we covered righteousness and the attempt made by community members to immerse themselves with the Christ Spirit as much as possible and everything in their environment, and the good and bad that came from that. I really don't have anything to add to that this week. It's pretty much where it's at. I might add something in the future, as always. Anything is subject to be added to here. Seriously though, my memory is pretty sketchy about that time, even though it wasn't all that long ago. I've been thinking a bit this week about belonging, and I need to be over here. And my quest to belong with people. I'm in a weird place. I'm only really 8 years old in this world. 8 years ago, I was driving horses. I was lighting fires with sticks. I was carrying water in buckets. And I was terrified that I would have to change my life. Since then, I've completely left that lifestyle, and I'm radically different now than I was then, even though in many ways I feel like I'm a truer version of what I was attempting to be then. But it's a strange thing now dealing with belonging, because I didn't belong in community, and there's a lot of times that I don't feel like I belong quite in this world. There's so much that I've missed. There's so many holes in my experience, like the typical high school experience. Don't have it. Learned to drive when I was 31, so I wasn't an irresponsible teenager in a car. I never really had alcohol until I was 31 years old, so I didn't have wild 20s. So there's a lot of common references that the people around me share, a shared experience that I don't have any part of that. It's absolutely absent, and that's kind of an eerie and disconcerting feeling. On one hand, I spent most of my teens trying to be a real masculine man, to the point of toxicity that carried well into my 20s, before I began to figure out that I am simply myself. And it took a while for me to realize who that was. It took me a while to move to that person that I am with strength, rather than trying to be someone else, rather than trying to belong with other people. And I think at this point in my life, less than a year away from 40 years old, I think that I'm beginning to figure it out. And that is that I'm just going to be myself, and I'll leave a place in me where other people, if they would choose to fit with me, they can find belonging with me. I feel that that's a powerful stance. And I also feel that it's a necessary stance because missing 2 decades out of your life, it's almost impossible to fit with anyone. I probably have daily conversations where someone will say, hey, have you seen this movie, or what about this, or you remember when you were 17? And I don't. I don't have those experiences. I haven't seen that movie. I didn't live that life. I never drove that car. I never did any of that. So I don't know if that's useful advice to anyone, whether you're an expatriate of community or whether you just struggle with belonging in your own life. That's something that I've just been thinking about this past week and reflecting on is how I interlace with the people around me and in my environment. And I am a bit of a stranger in a strange land, and I don't take that for granted. But for now, I'm just becoming a more sincere and purer version of myself, I guess. I'm refining that, and then the people around me that so choose can find the place with me to belong. At any rate, it's something to ponder. On to the third and possibly the fourth of the 4 foundations of community. Our next topic is common consent. Common consent is pretty self-explanatory. The words kind of say it all. It was a process of decision making and I guess on a subtler level, a means of securing support for any decision, any major decision that happened in community. And that could be anything from where to establish another village to how a person was going to be placed on the hierarchy or the inscription, or any one of dozens of topics. Any major decision making really was done through common consent, whether that be on the council, which was kind of the community's governing body, or one of several smaller governing bodies, one of them being called the older elders. They were tasked with spending the money that was commonly pooled, and they were all grandparents, people whose youngest child had a coming of age ceremony or was 14 or older. Shit, that's something I should have discussed in my women and men episode. Well, we'll kick it down the pipe a little bit. We'll discuss that later. Coming of age ceremony happened around 14 years old, and once a person's youngest child had achieved that milestone, then they were in training to be a part of the older elders. You also had the heads of household, which was any man with children between the ages of birth and the coming of age. And I think later just married men were annexed into that, and they made decisions about usage of land and that sort of thing. You also had the young mothers, who was kind of the counterpart of the heads of household. And the young mothers, that group was responsible for compiling lists of needs and prioritizing that, and then submitting that to the older elders for review. And the council of the community kind of crossed lines into those other groups frequently. Another decision-making body you had was, of course, the priesthood, who were deciding spiritual matters, and and planning out ceremonies and who would preach and so forth. Common consent was, in theory, supposed to be autonomous. That is not the word I was looking for. Unanimous decision making that was guided by the Spirit. So a person was, if the process was working perfectly or how it was intended, the person would take the topic that had been presented by whoever needed the decision or whoever was kind of spearheading that decision making. They would take that to God, get light on it, and then present that to the rest of the people, who would then pray and receive light on that. Then we'd all come together because God had told everyone the same thing, allegedly. Then everyone would agree or disagree, however it went, and then the decision would move forward or wouldn't. In practice, and weirdly enough, common consent probably was one of the most destructive and divisive aspects of community outside the bungled attempts at repentance and reproval, in my opinion. The Lord's Storehouse, which is the fourth foundation, was pretty much just utterly inept and was kind of destructive by dint of being absolutely ineffective in many areas, in my opinion. Common consent was where communal power games and politicking played out in real time, because most of the time it didn't go with 100% agreement. I've mentioned the hierarchy or inscription before, and it's worth noting that a person who was higher on inscription, their word in theory was not supposed to carry any more weight than anyone else's. In practice, it very definitely did, and occasionally that was brought up and leveraged in meetings. So these meetings decided on a very real level people's fate within community, and being recognized as someone who was spiritually powerful was kind of the currency of respect and acceptance within community. It purchased you breathing room from the constant pressure to be something different. Repentance and the environment of supposedly loving someone by constantly correcting them bred a paranoia of constantly being reproved. At any moment you could have some bad news delivered because God told someone something about you and you needed to change because of that. So being higher in inscription or being closer to God or having a more recognizable or greater service to God bought you a little bit of space, so that it wasn't that you wouldn't be reproved, it was simply that you were less likely to be. And so holding those positions, that was very coveted because that was recognition that you were spiritually powerful, but it was also some breathing room and some reprieve from the distress of thinking that you were going to be called out, or that you would lose position, or that you would be made a pariah because of some behavior. In common consent, how that worked a lot of times is someone of significant inscription, if not the first inscribed, who was my uncle, and still is to the best of my knowledge, would bring up a decision, they would oftentimes have the advantage, since the information wouldn't have been shared beforehand. It would be framed in a manner in which it was dire that that decision be made to the person tabling the decision, be made in favor of that, because that's what God was saying, and you can't go against God. An example of decisions that were maybe not life-destroying, but certainly very difficult for people. There was a number of people, my mother included, who were placed on 7 years. Now, 7 years was the whole days thing. They were on 7 years worth of days. Now, they didn't have to put a quarter back of their food during that 7 years, but they were only allowed to attend like things that took place on the Sabbath, like a church service that was open to everyone, and only certain events. They weren't able to attend any ceremonies, and there were several significant events that they weren't allowed to attend. Now, that may not sound like a huge deal, but it was a huge deal, because their spiritual power, or their ability to hear God or receive light from God, was viewed as significantly reduced. That means that pretty much anything they said, if they bothered to say anything at all, it was viewed with suspicion if it wasn't out and out discarded, simply based on the fact that they were on those 7 years of days. They had transgressed the law for so long that the reasoning went that they had transgressed the law for so long that they needed 7 whole years to get back on a path that was what God wanted them to do. That they had swung so far to error that they needed to have that time to swing back to being virtuous again. And that decision was made by the council. That decision was presented in such a way that this is the only solution for them. 7 was a sacred number in community, and one could seven oneself or do something so much that it was considered to be a permanent part of them. God dang it. So these people who were placed on 7 years had sevened themselves essentially in sin, and so had to seven themselves, or 7 years. They had to seven themselves, that was the language used, to virtue. We're going to go ahead and restart. So that's an example of the kind of decision that was made. I was involved in multiple meetings in which people left very upset because something had been decided that was not a good idea, that not only ran counter to common sense, but was also just a terrible idea, not productive or even destructive. And I was actually a part of a meeting in which a man that I respected and still respect very much, he and his sons were so utterly belittled and just dragged that they were all in tears and sobbing. And that was a breaking point for me. I left that meeting and pretty much told everyone involved that I would never be involved in such a meeting again, that there was no part of that that was moral or that was justifiable on any level, and that I was out, that I wasn't going to do that. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for me. Honestly, that set kind of an internal ball rolling that would not stop until I exited community. Once again, and I think that this is a frequent theme with community, the idea of it was sound. The practice of it was destructive, and that was rough. So decisions made in community, just to kind of wrap this up and move on. We're going to get to the fourth after all. To wrap it up, it wasn't a democracy. It was everyone agreeing on everything. That agreement, as often as not, if not more frequently, was extorted or manipulated in some way. The idea of everyone agreeing isn't necessarily a bad one. That's what I was trying to say earlier, that there was a good intention that misfired so frequently that it nullified any positive effect that might have come from it. So that was decision making. That is foundation 3. Foundation 4 is the Lord's storehouse, or all things common. And those are kind of the same thing, but not. The Lord's storehouse, I guess, would be a part of all things common. All things common was a concept that everything belonged to everybody. Or really, all things belonged to God and you were simply using it. Interestingly, that could have had the effect that you could go and take anything from anyone. I don't believe that happened very much. I know that it did happen, that there was, especially with like tools and things that would help the lifestyle. I believe, I can't remember specific instances, but there's a niggling in the back of my mind that I seem to remember at least a couple of guys who had a private tool collection that was more or less demanded be turned over to the public so that everyone could use it. I suppose that isn't the worst idea that anyone's ever had. However, it was pretty bad. Not only was it invasive, a lot of those tools that God needed so desperately were destroyed because people didn't know how to use them, or people didn't care for them properly, and items that should have lasted a lifetime or several lifetimes lasted a few years. So that was all things common. Everything essentially was supposed to belong to everyone. So animals, for example, were commonly kept, commonly cared for, even though they had a person that was primarily responsible for them, so it was viewed as their animal. Other people could and did use them, and it was never a thing that was, I won't say never. It was only occasionally a thing that caused friction, and that was only when it was when the person who was primarily responsible was kind of pushed aside or not considered. But there were a lot of things that were individualized, more or less, and a lot of things, most things, were common and used by everyone. a bigger part of that was the concept of the Lord's storehouse, or everything belonging to God. All natural resources were seen as something that belonged to God. So wild berries were a part of God's storehouse, and wherever they could be found, anywhere on the planet Earth, essentially, certainly in the region, since they belonged to God, we would go and get them. Personally, I have trespassed probably tens of thousands of times at least, just in the collection of wild berries. That concept of everything belonging to God turned out to be theft. At least in one case, we found a calf, a little red bull calf, in a creek that was part of the neighbor's cows, and it was considered by the leadership that cow wouldn't have been found by the farmer anyway, and it was delivered into the hands of community by God. So that cow was kept the cow. Cattle rustling. There were a lot of people who disagreed with that, but it was quashed because the Red Bull was considered sacred, and it was considered delivered into the hands of the righteous by God. And weird things like that were very frequent. When it came to providing things for people, and this is why I said earlier that it was largely ineffective, it provided cloth for clothing, and we'd sew, we'd buy bolts of cloth and pass out yardage, and people would make clothing, but clothing was almost always tattered or ratty. It was almost impossible with that physical a lifestyle to maintain clothes that weren't dirty and torn. It purchased things like underwear and socks and bras and so forth, but so infrequently that they were almost always dirty and had holes in them and so on. And medical care, almost non-existent. My teeth right now are pretty bad just due to the fact that didn't have a lot of access to a lot of dental care. Toothpaste was only purchased for the first several years, and then I think no one purchased toothpaste again, and we were brushing teeth with things like fucking baking soda. And let me tell you what, brushing your teeth with baking soda, and I do mean just baking soda in your mouth with a toothbrush, is not a good experience. Shit's nasty. So, providing, and the thing is that it was just a weird way of doing things. Money was considered evil, and a necessary evil. So we didn't really go out of our way to earn any. People who had retired were receiving Social Security checks. That was all kicked in. If you received money as a gift from relatives or friends that were outside of community, it was encouraged that was kicked in. Couldn't take it all the time, but a lot of times it was taken, or it was strongly suggested that be turned over to community. Incidentally, inheritances, I screwed that word up. Amounts of money that people inherited were turned over to community, with a notable exception of my aunt, my uncle's wife, got an inheritance. She didn't turn that over to community, or they didn't, rather. They did purchase things for people and did a lot of spending in the common interest, but it wasn't turned over to community. They decided how that was spent, which was very much in violation of the tenets of the Lord Storehouse, but once again, exceptions in almost every facet could be made for people of power or of high inscription. I'm sure that I'm missing a lot here, but I'm doing my best. So in short, dirty, hungry, cold, hot, ill, poor maintenance of health, and a diet that for at least the first 10-15 years was real poor, and then it did get somewhat better, but it still wasn't where it needed to be. Things like footwear, dude, that was a fucking heartache there. You were essentially expected to get a single pair of footwear and wear that through all manner of weather and make it last, because God expected you to care for your footwear. The paths, there's a lot of black dirt in southern Iowa, and what isn't black dirt is clay, and it rained as much as anywhere in the Midwest, and when you walked on those wet paths, it turned into mud, and most of the time that mud was soupy and covered your shoes, got in your shoes, and it was impossible to get ahead of the effects of mud and manure on leather, especially considering that shoe care products were not provided. So all in all, it wasn't an incredibly good idea, and in practice it was very, very ineffective, and that was actually one of the reasons why I left, is I didn't want to have my son deal with that lack of hygiene, with that lack of ability to care for your person, and to constantly be in want of shoes and underwear and socks and clothing and coats and food. I wasn't going to do that to him. So I took a gamble, and the gamble paid off. A lot of good people outside of community were very supportive and very generous. I think I've mentioned that before, but it bears mentioning again. Anyway, I'm sure people that were there and experienced it will fill in any blanks, and I'll cover next week anything that I've neglected to say here. But by God, it was a rough go. It was a rough go. So those are the four foundations of community, and that was the basis of the law and the principles upon which community were founded. Those things were that was the substructure of pretty much everything in community. So that would be repentance, or how people made up for their wrongdoings and how they interacted with one another. Righteousness, which was how one interacted with one's environment. Common consent, how decisions were made. One thing on common consent is not everybody attended the council meetings. If you were on days, for example, 7 years, you weren't a part of those meetings. So decisions were being made about people that were not present all the time. Anyway, and things said, and they weren't able to defend themselves. So you had common consent, which was decisions, and then you had the Lord's Storehouse, or the means of providing. All in all, there were some positives in there. For me, in my experience, the negatives far, far outweighed any gain that was to be had from those. Next week, Can't think of what I'll do next week right off the top of my head, so I guess it'll be a surprise. Probably for me as much as anyone. At some point I do need to talk briefly about calendar and times, since it was out of sync with the rest of the world, and all that. But for now, I think that's pretty much going to do it. So I'll wrap things up on this one. I'm currently doing a video every day in August, or Veda. That's now on the channel. Got 3 of those up. It's been fun and challenging. The past couple of weeks have been incredible and very gratifying for me. My aunt shared one of my posts, and a lot of people responded a lot to that. I got a lot of subscribers out of that. By a lot, I mean 10 or 12. And then a very good friend of mine, Maddie, really supported me and shouted me out to their viewership. Broke 50 subs. Super pumped about that. And they're mentoring me right now, Maddie is. And that's been awesome. So I'm excited about the direction that this is going. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit frazzled. I'm kind of tired and at the end of my ability to think on the fly. So right now you're just seeing my brain melt down on camera. I'm sure that's everything you hoped it would be. At any rate, if you enjoyed this and you are new to this and you've watched this far, thank you. If you've not subscribed, I'd really appreciate it. If you have questions, I welcome them all, and we'll talk about it, and I'll answer them. If you comment, I'll do my best to respond to your comment. I've got media links in the description, as well as this week I'm going to put in a link to their meeting communities website that is on an intentional community page or site or whatever. Anyways, I'll post a link about community. You can see some pictures that they've posted there, and you can kind of get a feel for what things look like. With that, once again, thank you, and peace. This episode's all done.